For decades, the world has watched Julian Lennon grow up in the long shadow of one of the most legendary musicians in history, his father, John Lennon. But behind the fame, the music, and the polished interviews, there was a storm brewing inside Julian that the public never truly understood, until now. In a rare and brutally honest confession, Julian finally admitted something he had kept buried for most of his life. Something that reveals the deep emotional scars left behind by a childhood filled with abandonment, betrayal, and complicated relationships. When he said the words, "I truly hated her," he wasn't talking about a random Hollywood figure, a journalist, or even a fellow musician. His resentment was directed at someone far closer, someone the world greatly admired, yet Julian saw through very different eyes. For years, fans assumed Julian had healed, moved on, and accepted the past. But what if he never fully did? What if the truth was more painful than any biography or interview ever revealed? What if the person he resented most wasn't just part of his trauma, but a symbol of everything he lost? Today we uncover the story Julian Lennon rarely speaks about, the fractured family, the replacement he never wanted, and the emotional truth the world was never meant to hear. This isn't just about fame. It's about a son who grew up watching the world love the people who helped destroy the life he once knew. Julian Lennon entered the world in 1963, at a time when the Beatles were transforming from a local Liverpool band into a global phenomenon. While the world saw magic, greatness, and cultural revolution, Julian saw something very different behind the closed doors of fame: distance, absences, broken promises, and a father who was becoming a stranger long before he ever understood why. To millions, John Lennon was a symbol of peace, love, and artistic genius. But to young Julian, he was the man who was rarely home, rarely available, and emotionally disconnected even when he was physically present. As Beatlemania grew louder, the silence between father and son grew even deeper. Fans never saw the nights Julian waited at the window, hoping his father would visit, or the birthdays spent without a call, a card, or even a memory of being acknowledged. Everything changed in 1968, when John Lennon left Julian's mother, Cynthia, for a new life with Yoko Ono. That moment didn't just end a marriage, it divided Julian's world in two. He wasn't just losing a father, he was being replaced. The world celebrated John and Yoko as a revolutionary artistic couple, calling their love story destiny, cosmic, beautiful. But to Julian, it was the moment someone else stepped into a space that once belonged to him and his mother. Interviews would later reveal Julian's inner truth. He didn't just dislike Yoko. He truly resented her. Not because she was unique, strange, or controversial to the public, but because she became the woman who took his father away. She wasn't just a new partner, she became a symbol of abandonment. While the world praised her, Julian saw her as the person who stood between him and the father he still desperately wanted. Julian grew up watching John's new life unfold in headlines, photographs and interviews, a life that rarely included him. He watched the world adore Yoko's son, Sean Lennon, while he remained on the sidelines. And the bitterness that built inside him wasn't just jealousy, it was the pain of being erased, replaced, and ignored. Over time, Julian learned to stay quiet. He learned to smile in public, answer politely in interviews, and pretend the past didn't hurt as much as it really did. But deep inside, the anger stayed. The resentment toward Yoko, the woman the world saw as John's great love, became a wound that never quite healed. It would take decades before he finally spoke the words out loud and admitted how deeply that pain had shaped him. As Julian grew older, the emotional distance between him and his father didn't shrink. It widened. John Lennon was not just a missing parent. He had become a global icon, a man worshipped by millions for preaching peace and love, while his own son felt none of it. The public adored John's message, but Julian lived with the contradiction no fan had to face. How could the world celebrate a man who couldn't even show love to his own child? Interviews from those years quietly revealed the truth. Julian wasn't just hurt, he was confused. He saw his father speak about unity while breaking his own family apart. He saw headlines that painted John and Yoko as spiritual, enlightened, kind, while the boy they left behind was struggling just to understand why he wasn't enough. When John and Yoko welcomed their son, Sean, in 1975, it felt like the final confirmation that Julian had been replaced. John stepped away from the spotlight to be a full-time father, something he had never offered Julian. For the world, it was a touching story of a man rediscovering family. For Julian, it was a knife in the heart. He wasn't just forgotten. He was erased from the new narrative. The media rarely mentioned Julian. Fans called Sean John's legacy. Yoko publicly spoke of spiritual bonds, artistic love, and emotional connection, but never of the broken boy still waiting for a father's affection. The world adored her, and Julian quietly carried resentment he didn't dare voice. He began to speak carefully in interviews, choosing words that would not damage his already fragile connection to his father. But after John's death in 1980, the silence finally broke. Julian was not even mentioned in the will, a decision made under Yoko's guidance. The message was clear. Emotionally, legally, and symbolically, Julian had been pushed out of John's life, even after death. And that's when the anger turned into something deeper. It wasn't just about losing his father anymore. It was about being denied the right to even belong to him. Julian later said he had to fight for every penny, while Sean never had to ask for anything. The contrast was painful, unfair, and unforgettable. For years, Julian tried to heal, tried to forgive, tried to understand. He followed in his father's footsteps musically, but every step felt like walking through the shadows of a man who never chose to walk beside him. And all through that journey, the unspoken truth remained. The woman the world loved, the woman praised for her brilliance, creativity, and influence, was the same woman Julian silently blamed for everything he lost. It would take decades before he finally admitted what he truly felt. I didn't just resent her. I hated her. Julian Lennon carried his feelings like a secret storm. Friends, journalists, and fans often assumed his quiet demeanor and polished interviews meant he had reconciled the past. But the truth, as he finally admitted, was far more complicated. The anger, the bitterness, and the resentment toward Yoko Ono were not fleeting emotions. They were deeply rooted scars from a childhood he could never rewrite. The breaking point came during a rare, in-depth interview. Julian had been asked about his relationship with his father and his feelings toward Yoko, questions he had deftly sidestepped for years. But this time, something shifted. Perhaps it was age, perhaps it was reflection, or perhaps it was a desire to finally set the record straight. He took a deep breath and, for the first time publicly, he allowed the full weight of his emotions to surface. I truly hated her. Those words shocked fans. Journalists, and even those who had followed Julian's life closely. To the public, Yoko had long been painted as a misunderstood artist, a creative partner, and a devoted mother to Sean Lennon. But Julian's confession revealed a side of history that had rarely been acknowledged. The perspective of a son left behind, a boy who watched his father choose another life, another family, and another love, while his own needs were sidelined. Julian explained that his hatred was not born out of malice, but out of pain. Every milestone in John's life, from albums to awards to new family celebrations, was a reminder of what Julian had lost. Even as an adult, he carried the echoes of those empty birthdays, the absence of guidance, and the invisible wall that kept him from the father he longed to know. His anger toward Yoko, he said, was intertwined with grief. Grief for a relationship that never had a chance, grief for a childhood shadowed by neglect, and grief for the unfair comparisons between himself and Sean. Yet there was nuance. Julian's confession was not a call for revenge or hatred for its own sake. It was a human acknowledgement of complex emotions that few could understand. He admitted that speaking out was liberating, a step toward confronting his past and claiming the truth of his experiences, no matter how uncomfortable it made others feel. For the first time, the world heard the story from Julian's perspective, a story of abandonment, betrayal, and a son's struggle to reconcile love and resentment. His honesty reminded fans that behind every legend, every icon, there are human stories, often painful, often messy, and rarely as simple as they appear in the headlines. After decades of silence, avoidance, and inner turmoil, Julian Lennon began the slow and painful process of confronting his past. Admitting that he truly hated her was only the first step, a raw, honest confession that validated his feelings but did not erase the wounds. Healing, he realized, would require more than words. It would demand reflection, understanding, and a willingness to separate the actions of others from his own sense of self. Julian began to revisit his childhood with new eyes. He acknowledged the pain of abandonment, the frustration of being sidelined, and the resentment toward Yoko Ono. But he also began to see the complexity of the situation. Yoko, he realized, was not solely responsible for the choices his father made. John had agency, flaws, and decisions that ultimately shaped Julian's childhood. By reframing his understanding, Julian started to reclaim power over his own story, not by rewriting the past, but by owning the narrative from his perspective. Music became a critical outlet in this journey. Following in his father's footsteps, Julian pursued his own career as a musician, using songs to process emotions that had long been suppressed. The creative process offered him a space to explore anger, loss, and reconciliation in ways words alone could not. For the first time, he could tell his story on his terms, allowing the world to see Julian Lennon, the artist and the son, rather than merely John Lennon's replacement. Over time, Julian also learned to redefine what family meant. He nurtured relationships with people who chose to be present in his life, friends and mentors who offered the love and guidance that had been missing in his formative years. He discovered that healing did not require forgiveness of the past in the traditional sense, but rather acknowledgement, acceptance, and the willingness to move forward without letting resentment dictate his future. Today, Julian's reflections are candid and inspiring. He speaks openly about his feelings, his journey, and the emotional toll of growing up in the shadow of a legend. While the anger toward Yoko may never fully vanish, it no longer controls him. Instead, it serves as a reminder of resilience, the ability to confront painful truths, to speak them, and to chart a path toward emotional freedom. Julian Lennon's story is a profound testament to the complexity of family, fame, and personal growth. It reminds us that behind every headline and public image lies a human experience, full of contradictions, struggles, and ultimately, the hope of healing. In admitting his truth, Julian did more than share a confession. He reclaimed his narrative, proving that even in the shadow of giants, one can find their own light.